For me, a good leader is when we talk about leadership, in my opinion, there is an implicit concept there of power. So a good leader is the one that decides to use that power to the benefit of others. What do you do to change systems of oppression? What do you do to make sure that the most people can access to the means of advancement?
Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we're gathered here this evening on the occupied territory of the Massachusetts people. We pay respect to Massachusetts elders, past, present, and future, who, despite the violence perpetuated against them, have stewarded this land for generations and continue to be in relationship with it. As an institution striving to be a meeting place for all world cultures, we are committed to sharing and examining stories that have traditionally been untold. And for me, as the descendant of people who were enslaved in this country, it is important for me to acknowledge that stolen land came before stolen labor. And that brings us to this discussion, which will be moderated by Cristela Guerra. After the discussion, we hope you will add your voice to the conversation for Q&A. Cristela is an arts and culture reporter for The Artery. She worked for nearly 4 years at the Boston Globe, writing human interest features, covering everything from blizzards to arts to immigration, as well as breaking news around New England. She started her career in Florida, logging 7 years at the News Press, where she wrote about the Cape Coral City Hall, crime, education, LGBTQ issues, and business. She's driven to understand people's passions, committed to local communities, and hopes to use the arts as a lens to delve deeper into stories of equity, culture, social justice, and race. Cristela, please lead us into our discussion.
Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? Yeah? I see some familiar faces. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. I'm going to open it up for questions fairly early, like half an hour in. I want you guys to engage with us, ask questions, think about what we're discussing, and let's just sort of, let's just have a conversation, yeah? We have some wonderful panelists that I've had the pleasure of speaking to before here to talk through what we wanted to really discuss tonight, but I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves first. If you all want to start, maybe Kendra?
Hello, everybody. My name is Kendra Hicks, and I am a local Bostonian and artist, and also a nonprofit executive.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to see all of you and be here today as we celebrate Latinx Heritage Month. My name is Celina Miranda, and I'm the Executive Director of Hyde Square Task Force. We are a creative youth development organization located in Boston's Latin Quarter, which is part of Jamaica Plain in Boston. And I'm originally from El Salvador, an immigrant, grew up in Southern California, and a transplant to Boston.
Hola everyone, I'm Rafael Calvo. I am an associate professor at Boston College at the School of Social Work, where I'm also the founding director of the Latinx Leadership Initiative, which pretty much focuses on increasing the number and the presence of Latinx social workers in the United States, and I use the she series pronouns.
So the theme of the evening, I mean, you all know this, is how do we develop Latinx leaders and increase Latinx leadership? It's a good goal, but we recognize there's a lot of obstacles to that place. So I thought I'd start somewhere very simple and ask, what are the qualities and values that make up a good leader, which is often something you see in professional development in general? And then what are the qualities and values that make a good Latinx leader? Can you talk to that uniqueness that we bring to the table when it comes to any institution, really? And anybody can start if you'd like.
I will start. Then. For me, a good leader is, when we talk about leadership, in my opinion, there is an implicit concept there of power. So a good leader is the one that decides to use that power to the benefit of others. What do you do to change systems of oppression? what do you do to make sure that the most people can access to the means of advancement? What makes a good, or what is unique about Latinx leadership? What is unique is that, and I'm gonna go where, my son told me, just talk about what you know, mommy. Just talk about what you know. So, dale pues. There is a lot of evidence that shows that when you have ethnic concordance, so when you are leading an institution, an organization that mostly serves Latinx populations, the outcomes are better. Doesn't matter what you look at. If you work in social services as a social worker, and that's my area of expertise, if you look at engagement, you need a Latinx leader there because your outcomes are going to be better. Even if you don't care about Latinx, just do it for the well-being of your organization. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Someone else?
So, I think there's the usual stuff that folks talk about, right? It's about being honest, integrity, et cetera, and I believe in all of those. But when I think about sort of, you put the Latinx lens into leadership, I think one of the things that sometimes when we find ourselves in predominant white spaces is that when we start being our authentic selves, and we start uplifting, family, right? The sense of familia. And you bring that into your work, or you bring in the priority of the collective versus the individual. It is those things, I think, that set us apart. And also a level of humility. I don't know about you all, but I know that my mom, right, raised me of like, con humildad, mija. Like that's how you carry yourself in the world. You don't carry yourself as you're better than other people. You're not. And this is how you're going to do it. So when you look at sort of the way we show up in spaces, it's sometimes very different than the mainstream tells us what a leader should look like and should be. And so I think it's for Latino leaders or for Latinx leaders, it's continuously sort of fighting against that. And how do you hold on to that and still sort of find your way and be able to, I think, for those of us who have dedicated our lives to social services and sort of thinking about others, it really is about how do you do it in a humble way, in a way that allows others to shine and others to come along. I see that as my responsibility, right, for the young people that I show up to work for every day, is making sure that they have a space to be seen, because oftentimes they're in spaces when they're not seen.
For me, I have two things that make an effective leader. My mentor said to me a couple of days ago, actually, he said that Indigenous people don't give people power unless they've earned it through service. And for me, an effective leader is somebody who positions themselves to be of service, whether it be to the mission, to their people, and to the community. I think secondly, and almost like more importantly, a leader for me is somebody who needs to be self-reflective. So people who are in leadership positions, how are you going inward and looking for your own stuff, right? What are my biases? What are the things that I bring with me? What are the things that have been taught to me that I'm bringing into this position? How am I enacting power on other folks in subordinate positions to me? And so for me, a really effective leader needs to be somebody who's really self-reflective and open to experimenting with all of the ways that they can be different than what they've been taught to be. And a Latinx leader, a real effective Latinx leader, well, the thing that came up to me was culture. As far as how can we be effective Latinx leaders, I think oftentimes we find ourselves in white institutions, and our goal is to be the best within that institution by assimilating into what that institution is asking us to be. When in reality, our power is in stepping outside of what's expected from us and bringing our authentic selves and our culture into our positions.
Thank you very much. Those answers were brilliant, and I really appreciated them, honestly. I hope that you all have sort of follow-up questions on that. I do. And you actually answered one of my other questions, which was how do we navigate mostly white spaces? So I may just skip that. But why don't we get into, Selena, something that you focus in on, which is building up young leaders of color and encouraging mentorship in these communities, because then we can talk about the pipeline to creating leaders in both middle management and I think executive levels. Yeah.
So at Heights Square Task Force, that's exactly what we're doing. So we're really focused on working with mostly Latinx youth. Most of them are Afro-Caribbean youth. And our focus is really on making sure that they have a space where they can come and be their creative selves. So we use creative youth development or the arts as a way of engaging young people. And we focus specifically on Afro-Latin arts, and that's purposeful. It really is about grounding our young people in who they are culturally and ethnically and racially, and really for them to think about it. Doesn't mean that all of our young people share sort of an Afro-Latin descent. However, by immersing themselves in that, they're able to sort of think about what does it mean for themselves. And I start with that because I think it's so important. I think some of us, at least if I can speak for myself and my experience, I didn't start sort of that inquiry into my identity in that way, in a deep way, until I got to college. I went to Smith College, a predominantly white, privileged institution, and I was the first in my family to go to college. My parents, my mom was a housekeeper, my dad had his own business, barely making enough for us to get by. So with that background, being in that setting, it's the first time that I started to think, okay, what does it mean to be Salvadoreña? What does it mean to be the first in my family to go to college? All of these questions. So we start that process a lot earlier for our young people, which I think then sets them up for greater success. Because when then they go to post-secondary education, they're ahead. They've been thinking about that already. So being then immersed in a predominantly white space is not so much of a shock. So we do that. Then we also focus on making sure that we're supporting our young people through the education system, because we know that the education system works against them. So we need to make sure that we're there supporting them every step of the way so they get through middle school, they get through high school, they plan for the future, and pursue some post-secondary option. We're pretty agnostic. They don't have to go to the 4-year college. They can really decide what that path is for them, but we do want them to have options and choices. So we do that. And we could very well stop there and say, you know what, we're building that leadership, we're building that pipeline, but that's not sufficient. So the third component of our model, which I think it's what distinguishes us from other programs in the city, is that we focus on civic engagement and youth organizing. And we do that because we want to make sure our young people realize the volume of their voice. And I don't say they find their voice, they have a voice, right? But they actually recognize how loud, how powerful they can be in their own right as young people. And so they are able to, through the civic engagement component of our work, identify issues that they care about, identify change that they want to see in their community, however they define that. It could be their school setting, it could be their neighborhood, it could be within our building, because we do empower them, and then they tell us, you're doing that wrong, and we gotta respond, right? But by being able to nurture all these different aspects of them, we are really creating them and setting them up for success. I'm very proud to say that on my board, I have 4 of our alumni on the board, and that is great. The fact that they are my bosses, that they are there leading the organization alongside with me. It's how we're doing it. It's how we're sort of building and making sure that they develop the skill set that they need to be successful.
And just as a follow-up, it was the students at Heights Square Task Force that actually took, was it TD Garden to task?
That's correct.
Yeah.
So 2 years ago, they realized that TD Garden hadn't been following a piece of legislation that passed over 20 years ago. And we said, don't hold back. I know you're going to upset a lot of people. The governor wasn't so happy, and other state officials weren't very pleased that they were making noise, but we said, go for it, do it, because there's people in power that weren't doing the right thing.
How much money did you end up getting?
They ended up in total being able to get over $5 million for a project in our neighborhood.
Rocio, can you talk to something we were just discussing, but very much the idea of mentoring from a place of asset versus deficit, and kind of explain to folks what that means? I had never really considered that, but I have perhaps been told in certain work environments that certain elements of my personality aren't beneficial, which is being Latina. You know, I mean, like, I'm loud, I have opinions. The asset of me as a Latina in a newsroom is not that I just speak Spanish. The asset of me as a Latina is a lot more than that. So, could you discuss this?
Absolutely. And that goes back to how you navigate a space that are not used to you. Not only as an individual, but as a community. So that's one of the things that is part of what we do. When students come to the Latinx Leadership Initiative, they enter into a model with value what they bring. Usually in higher education, when we think or when Latinos are thought from a position or from a perspective of deficit. What do they lack? Is that their writing is not good enough? Is that they don't know good? So the perspective that they get is, on the contrary, is what they bring to the table. If we are talking about leadership and you stop thinking a little bit, and actually this is funny, this morning I ran into a colleague, a professor, and I said, we were talking about something else, and he said, I have one of your students in my class, and they kind of are incredible. And I said, yeah, and you kind of sound surprised. No offense. And said, yeah, and I said, think, for that student to be in an institution like this, everything that student have to go through, you have a leader there. You don't have to add anything. You just have to create a space where those skills of leadership can flourish. Don't add anything. It's more a question of actually taking off all this socialization that you are not good enough, your culture is not good enough, the way you move your hands is not good enough. It's more taking, though, is actually deconstructing and valuing and actually acknowledging that is already there. And they don't have to leave who they are outside the door to be allowed inside, because they are valued for who they are. I'm going to give you an example. I teach my classes in Spanish, not all of them, but a fair amount. And why do you think? Because people don't speak English? I'm the worst English speaker in the LLI. Everybody speaks English as their first language. But by bringing Spanish to the classroom, in an academic setting that is not used to that, you are actually signaling, you are giving permission that you are allowed to habitate this space 100% as you are. A couple of years ago, I had an epiphany moment, one of those that, so we were discussing there, and it's in Spanish, and everybody can bring who they are to the table and their experiences. And somebody said, wait, everybody. I said, this is how the majority must feel. I will never forget that moment. Because it comes from assets. So when they tell me, what do you do? I said, I don't do much. But just drawing from that asset. And Spanish is only one thing. If I build a curriculum that shows the literature of what works in working with Latinx communities, evidence-based curriculum, and guess what? Most of the things that are actually effective do not build on, you have to add this, but build on the cultural assets that the community bring, and actually trains providers of services on how let those flourish. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Kendra, first of all, thank you, Rocio. Thank you very much. And what I really loved was when we spoke, she just kept telling me, you really need to speak to my students. My students are excellent. I shouldn't be up here. My students are really the ones that should speak for themselves. And it's kind of amazing. And I actually would like to potentially do a story at some point. I have my editor in the audience. I think it's a good story.
I was like, are they here? Raise your hand.
Kendra, do you want to talk about sort of organizational structures? So very much starting in addressing the institution's systems from the ground up. Yeah. And let's talk to some of the issues with the Latinx community when it comes to addressing all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that invitation. I think one of the things that was coming up to me as I was hearing you speak, particularly about mentorship, and so I just spoke on a panel recently about with other millennial executive directors, like nonprofit executive directors, about how to build up millennial leadership. And one of the core takeaways that came up for us were about mentorship. And so one of the things that comes up for me when talking about the Latinx community in particular is that a lot of the access that younger people have and millennials have in the Latinx community comes from a building of a social capital. And so mentorship is really important because it helps people build that social capital. I think on the other side of that coin, when you look at Latinx leadership retreats, when you look at Latinx leaders, when you look at Latinx leaders in Congress or in politics, they all look the same. Everybody is either a lighter skinned, mestizo looking person, or you have the one token black Latinx person in the group. And that's not unusual to find in most of the places. And so I have never, as a black Latina, been in leadership spaces that were only Latinx. And so I think that I want to tie this back to my point that I made about what makes a good leader is about being self-reflective, right? How are our own biases coloring who we decide to mentor? How are our own biases coloring who we let into these programs? And how are our own biases therefore then setting up certain Latinx people for success and not others? And so I think, you know, for me, that's really at the core. I think structure relates to that in the way that I think about it is I'm just like, organizations are structures, but they're led by people. Right? And so everybody has their stuff, and you have to be able to unpack your stuff. You want to look at your things. And when I think about organizational structures, particularly hierarchy, doesn't necessarily create the collaborative space that you need to see everyone's leadership. And so if you bring your own implicit biases into your organization, and then you have a structure that doesn't allow you to experience everybody's leadership, and so then you're picking certain people to be in leadership, then it's kind of like a self-perpetuating cycle of who gets to be at the top and who gets to have power. And so I am a proponent of having more collective structures. I'm not the enemy of hierarchy. I believe hierarchy is in nature, and I'm an emergent strategy practitioner, and so hierarchy exists. I'm not an enemy of hierarchy. But I think that when you, particularly within organizations, and even in for-profit businesses, when you create a structure to do work more collectively, you get to experience the leadership of more people. And giving that access is often giving to those people that are more in proximity to us. When you create that, then it gives more access to people, to Latinx folks, and particularly to black folks.
Thank you. If I could add to that, from a journalism background, I participate in a lot of programs for young journalists of color to encourage young journalists of color in high school and college. And what we find is if they stick with, you know, if they keep in touch with us, if they're the kind of kids that want to end up in broadcast and radio and print. I met the recruiter at the Globe when I was 21. She hired me when I was 30. And it's because I kept seeing her at the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and handing her a new resume with added stuff. And most of the time it wasn't that interesting, but one year it worked out. I had Latino journalists building me up to tell me to go forward, and now I give back because I was given to. And I think in terms of how we cover our communities, it's incredibly crucial to have the media represent us and all of us fully. In every newsroom I've been in, there's always been at least one Latinx journalist who was doing the hiring or encouraging the interns and telling us, you know, you can cover immigration, yeah, but you don't have to cover immigration. You know, you can cover communities of color very well, but you can also cover other things. You can do the big story, you can get the front page piece. Know what you bring to the table and then get a seat at the table. Because if you don't, we're not going to get into those places. It's just true. Let's talk about my favorite topic. Let's discuss imposter syndrome. Oh, yeah. Rocio, you want to start?
want to discuss imposter syndrome. And what I want to propose is to move imposter syndrome from the individual, because we blame the victim, oh, you have imposter syndrome, to the institution is signaling you that you do not belong. So let's change the focus. Because if we keep focusing on the individual, nothing is going to change systemically. If we acknowledge how institutions signal individuals whether they belong or not, then the responsibility is on the institution. If I have imposter syndrome, it's because this institution is telling me I don't belong here. Not because I don't belong here. Because I'm constantly reminded that this is not my space. So how do we change those spaces for Latinx communities being able to be who they are 100% without being questioned constantly whether they belong or not? They are go to higher education again. What is the assumption of, oh, somebody must be affirmative action. You do not belong here. Or got here because, there is a quota or something. So let's change systems. Let's change how that works. Imagine if, as a professionals, when we do our annual evaluations, and when I talk about changing systems, I don't talk about abstractions. I talk about the specific actions. Let's say, we all have to do an annual performance review of some sort. Do we check about how are we doing from our front on this? Are there measurable items that move the needle forward? And I'm not talking only about hiring. I'm talking about, are we honest and transparent about our numbers, about retention? Because if we have gaps there, the issue is not in the individual. The issues are on the institution. And unless we make these changes institutionally with procedures that follow this up, it will go always back to the individual, and nothing will change, and it's false.
To sort of follow up that question, how do your organizations retain and bring in Latinx leaders? Where we talked about starting them young, but then how do you keep them? Kendra, do you mind kind of talking to the issue of like how your organization reaches, retains, and I think encourages? I've heard people use the word, there's diversity, there's inclusion, there's retention, and then there's belonging. Mm-hmm. Belonging is being thrown in all of a sudden. That's very exciting to me, but I'm a little skeptical, right, until like it works. But yeah, can you talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so for those of you who haven't read my bio in the program, I'm the director of radical philanthropy at a national foundation that's based here in Boston. I saw some hands up. Yay, resist. And so being in my 20s and being an executive director of a national organization is not something that I was expected to be thrown into. And it was definitely not inclusive, and it definitely didn't feel like belonging in that moment. But in the past 5 years, we've been able to shift that. And I think the way that we've been able to shift that is by, one, not only having the leadership present in the organization, but giving them power. And I think that, culture is upstream from structure. And so when you give people power, they build your organization to look like how it should, to function in the ways that it should. And so at Resist in particular, we like to hire people that come from the communities that we serve. Because we're a foundation and we're a national foundation, we have hundreds of grantees all over the country and over a dozen that are local here. And so we like to pull people who've come from those communities to come and work at the foundation because they're really bringing the lens that we want. And we keep them there by paying them well first and giving them lots of benefits, giving them lots of time off, paid parental leave, and by giving them power and giving them the power to make decisions in their programming. And so at Resist, we are a worker self-directed nonprofit. And a worker self-directed nonprofit is a marriage between a cooperative and a traditional nonprofit. And I think the difference in a worker self-directed nonprofit is that instead of the board, the staff collective actually has the decision-making power within the organization. And so in that way, even our structure supports the people who are most impacted by those decisions within the organization to have power and lead the organization in that direction. And our board, very humbly, as very, very humble and reflective leaders, have passed on that power to us. And so we have been able to keep a Black and brown staff at this national foundation because we've given them power.
Thank you. Selena, you want to jump in?
I'm trying to think of which piece I should respond to, but in terms of, I think one of the challenges that we face at Hyde Square Task Force in terms of keeping and retaining talent is the fact that we are a small nonprofit. And so therefore, one of the things that I do pride myself in is that, for 3 years since I've been executive director, I'm committed to making sure that our salaries continue to go up. I want to make sure that people's talents are recognized. And, if I, as the executive director, require, a certain pay, I want to make sure that it's trickling down to everybody. It's not just me, because I'm not the organization. I'm simply the face of the organization, but it's not about me. So making sure to do that. The other part is making sure that we create a space where people can bring their entire selves. I think that's important. I think one of the pieces that I've worked my career, actually, I've spent it most of the time in predominantly white spaces. And I know that there's been times where I leave a certain little part, I've had to leave a certain little part of myself out the door, simply because, not because I didn't have the courage to bring it in, because you know what, sometimes you're tired. And you're like, I'm not gonna be explaining myself to you. It's easier to leave that part out the door. I'll pick it up on my way out, and when I go home, there I let it go, right? But the reality is that sometimes you just don't have the energy within you. And then I was thinking about the imposter syndrome, and I was thinking about my career and sort of why I find myself where I find myself right now. And I started, so I have a master's in social work and a master's in education. And I have a PhD in social work and sociology. And I was in an academic setting, academia. That's the path I was going to follow. But I didn't fit the model. And so I started to question myself, right? Maybe there's something wrong with me. And you know what part of me did not fit? It was the part of me that wanted to be in the community. It was the part of me that was committed to staying true to why I became a social worker to begin with. No, I don't just want to write research papers. No, I don't just want to spend my time publishing. That is great. But you know what? The knowledge we create up here doesn't trickle down to community when the community needs it. And so that's what I wanted to do. And so I said, forget it, I'm out of here. I started working in philanthropy for a long time, and then I was like, all right, that space is still stifling. So now I'm gonna go to another space, and I feel like for the first time in my career, I actually can bring my entire self into the building. Right, I can bring my nerdy academic self into the building. I can bring my Salvadoran self to the building. I can bring my experience, all my lived experience into the building, and it's recognized and it's seen, and it's actually an asset, not a deficit.
Yes, clap. That's clapping, for sure. It's a very good idea. So I'm going to open it up. I'm sure, there are questions, I'm assuming. I'm hoping.
How do you guys consolidate the action that our Black brothers and sisters took in the 1960s and what we should be doing today as Latinos in this country? How do you guys consolidate the two manners of revolution and revolutionize thinking and whatnot? Sorry.
I don't. For two reasons. One, I guess I don't in my role. I don't have any illusions that my organization is somehow going to bring us liberation as people. And I think that that's one of the differences, right? There were a lot of lots of community-based organizing, lots of direct action, lots of people on the ground. And so the reason why I say is that I don't is because I think that my organization, in particular as a foundation, serves a specific function, and it's not to do that. I do that on my own personal time, right? That's when I do the work of liberation, is organizing with my people and after work. None of that work has ever come from a 501c3 or a nonprofit organization or any Latinx leader. It's just not the way that it works, and it's not the way that, like, my own personal theory of change, that's not how I believe that change happens. And so the reason why I don't reconcile those two things is because I manage my expectations of what we are going to be able to do. And as a foundation who funds really small grassroots organizations, my job is to give them the resources that they need to do what they do and to absorb the risk from up top for the work that they're doing, whatever that might mean.
Hi, thank you so much. Your talk has been, we've been snapping back here in appreciation of all your responses, so thank you so much. How do you deal with microaggressions?
Could you all hear it? How do you deal with microaggressions was the question, and that they're snapping in the back, me too.
Yes.
Yeah.
With the strategies of micro-resistance. For instance, I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to bring something on the table that I know is not going to be looked with, favorable eyes. And I know it's going to be a vote. So I have my votes before I go to the meeting. That's a strategy of micro-resistance. So instead of going there and just really making a valid and good argument, and I know it is, but I know it's not about the argument. I know it's valid. So, and I know how the system works. So a strategy of micro-resistance is having allies that are going to side by the proposal so it gets accepted by the institution. Another strategy of micro-resistance is anything I propose, I get out of there as soon as possible because I want the institution to embrace it. If it's only me, that's very fragile. If the institution commits to it, it has sustainability. I can go on and on about micro-resistance.
I think there are other ways sometimes, and I'm going to speak more from the individual experience. And I think there have been times where out of self-preservation, and I think this is the part that sometimes we take for granted, right? You can't be sort of reacting and responding to everything. But there have been times where I have said, and it's been in predominantly, I can think of one example in particular, that was, I think, by far the most conservative space I've ever worked in. And I think I would experience microaggressions about every other hour, right? Depending on who I saw at the cooler or whatever happened. But I remember at one point, I was pushing for a grant to get approved. And I started to get these questions. At first it was like, well, where do these kids come from? And then as the conversation continued, and then you know what I did? I just stayed silent. Sometimes I'm just silent. And I'm like, go ahead, because you're going to dig yourself so deep that it's going to go from micro to really, it's there. Let's just call it what it is. And I remember at that point saying, you know what? I know what I have to lose here. What I have to lose is my job. But you know what? I'm skilled. I have experience, and I don't care. So I remember sort of naming it for them. You just asked me this. Why don't you ask me the question you're really wanting to ask, which is, are they immigrants? Are they here undocumented? That's what you're asking me. Don't beat around the bush. That's what you're saying. So I remember pushing. This was like, I was talking to lawyers in the institution that I was working with. And I could have stopped there, but I didn't. And then I said, and I'm wondering how many of you have a housekeeper. And how many of you have you asked them if they are documented or undocumented? I bet you don't care. You just want your house clean. So I said it and I named it. And then, of course, it's like, oh, I'm sorry. I think this has become too personal for you. And I said, you betcha. I was like, because you didn't ask me what my documentation status was, years ago, right? So you're talking about me. So yes, it's personal. I remember slamming the door and then running to my boss and said, by the way, you're going to get a call from the 15th floor soon. And I was like, and if you want to fire me, go ahead. You hired a social worker, and you knew that when I came in. So guess what? I'm not gonna keep my mouth shut. Not when you're attacking my young people, right? So when you're attacking me individually, all right, I got this. But when it's about a group that I care about, I'm gonna stand up. But I remember sort of knowing what sacrifice I was making at that point. They could have kicked me out, right? Mind you, I found my way out. And soon enough, it became so oppressive that I had to leave. But it is these things where you have to sort of weigh, But if I had been sort of early in my career, I probably would have been a lot more hesitant to do that.
I think both of I've used both of those approaches. It's like, you respond often for myself immediately and right there. And then there are other moments where you're on the mode of self-preservation and you're just like, not today. I think my third stance around handling microaggressions that I think is really different than what the stance that we typically take is compassion. And the reason that I say that is because we live in a white supremacist world, and white supremacy is the waters that we are swimming in. And for that reason, we all have our stuff. And so sometimes I just have compassion for people who have been really good students of what they're being taught. And so sometimes I go, they don't know no better. It's just, and the reason why I do that is because I want to keep my heart tender. I don't want living in this world to harden me. And practicing compassion for people helps me keep my heart tender. Yeah.
Hi. I know that as leaders in your organizations, there are a lot of different situations that you may encounter that you may not always be able to address. But I'm just curious if you've recently become more aware or cognizant of some of the need to step up and step in for specifically Black and brown queer people of color. And I just wonder if there's an occasion or an example of a time when, given your own experience of being excluded or the challenges that come with being not white, if you've thought about, your own privilege as either a cis person or a straight person, and how you can kind of create bridges for, people who are that much more oppressed, right? So I'm just curious if you could share anything about that.
Every day, every single day when I wake up in the morning, I have a saying, and I tell this to people: I don't want my activism to end where my identities do. And so every day I'm just like, how do I go beyond? How do I go beyond? This is me, and how do I go beyond? One of the things that I do often when I'm facilitating is that I help people build their personal privilege profiles. And I get people of color, sometimes Black folks, who are just like, oh, this is, and then they go and they're like, oh, I'm like a Christian and I'm straight. And people start to uncover all of those privileges. And so I think for me, particularly in the Latinx community, it's one of the things that's of utmost importance, right? There's anti-Blackness and homophobia and transphobia. Those are the three pillars of our stuff that we need to unpack, right? And so, going back to my statement about having reflective leaders, it's about time that we start having those conversations, right? And not tokenizing people. And so I think that because I work at a foundation, it's been very easy for me, because we're like, oh, we have to support these people, give them their money, right? I'm just like, give them their things. We don't need any reports. What is it that you need to do, right? You're the rapper response money. It's very easy for me being in this position, because my job is to move resources so that people can do the work. It's not my job to tell queer folks that they have to do like this work. It's like, no, this is the work that we think is important for our community, and we need you to give us money to do it. And so in my position, that's how I step into that. It's like, what percentage of our money is going to Black and brown queer organizations, right? We only fund groups that are led by the people that they're serving. And so for us, it's like, oh, how many of these groups are led by these folks? Are we giving money to them? And so there's all of these considerations when we're trying to put that support there.
In terms of working with young people, that's something we're very conscious about, and we want to make sure that we create spaces that are open and that it's for everyone. And we make sure we do that. And it's been hard sometimes when we, I remember us having to deal with sort of a very conservative Dominican mom. And, she confronted us and said, you know what? You're allowing my daughter to explore the side of herself that there is just no place for it. And we're like, well, señora, lo siento mucho. This is what we do, right? This is what we do, and this is what we're going to continue to do. And also for some of our young people who say, I don't get, my peer who's trans. And we're like, well, we understand, and we're here to learn together. And you need to be open to that. And no, we just said it from the minute they walk in the door, that's the expectation. And we've had some young people who have walked out. We have some parents who have left us. But interestingly enough, about 6 months, 9 months later, they come back, right? Because they recognize that it's a space that was welcoming their child, that it was saying, we see all of you and we see everything that you bring. And we're not going to be selective. And so definitely continuously making space that doesn't just say the right things, but is doing the right thing.
The only thing I would add to that, because is the same approach from where I work, that is an academic setting, and what I do, that is train future social workers to work effectively with Latinx communities. We include in the training specific interventions that show validity and effective. So when they are with the communities, it's not only based on experience, which is valid, but is based on what works. So in that sense, we have actually do a revision of the explicit and implicit curriculum, what we are signaling, and we have made changes accordingly to include those skill set.
If I could shout out my workplace and my editor, Maria Garcia. I work at the Artery at WBUR, and I think that it's important to name that prior to, I was a print reporter at newspapers for about 13 years, and there's a very large difference. I'm a queer woman of color. There's a very large difference between being able to say that out loud as a journalist and not being able to say anything. Not just being Latina, but being Latinx and being queer and being able to own the fact that you're covering issues that directly affect you and having editors that understand that. Trigger warning, I guess, for difficult stories about trans folks. Newspapers cover a lot of Black and brown suffering. I feel that it's my responsibility not to just tell the whole story, but just to show when people aren't dying, and to not only go into the community when they're dead. Because how are you going to build trust with anyone if you're only there to exploit? In Florida specifically, there was an incident with a trans woman of color where they were going to cover her passing as a news brief. And I got in trouble because I wrote it as an obituary, and then I covered it the next day and the next day and the next day. And then I was told to have lunch with the editor where we discussed, and I was told the editor was concerned that I had an objectivity issue because I'm queer, and that I wasn't following directions properly in addressing this story. And I was told to ask, do you have a problem with how I covered the LGBTQ community? And I think I said, do you have beef with how I cover the gays? And then I said, do you have issues with how I cover breast cancer walks? Because, do you have a problem with how I cover like businesses that sell pants? Because, I don't know what to tell you. So I can't say that we're necessarily better off. That was about 10 years ago. but I know people that are doing the work. I know trans journalists that are doing the work, and I know that I work at a place where if something's racist, we name it.
Okay. So my question is sort of about the overarchingness of the term Latinx, who it includes and who it doesn't. So I think, Kendra, you mentioned that like often like the image of a Latinx person is like the mestizo, or like, you know, more mixed and less the Afro-Latinx person. Also, like, you know, I think I heard you say something like you bring more to the table that for being Latina than just speaking Spanish. But a lot of Latinx people don't speak Spanish. So I just want to hear more about that, I guess, in general.
Interesting fact. Do you know that the term Hispanic was created by the Congress in the 70s, and that we have the only law that the only law in the United States that mandates by Congress to collect data on an ethnic group is about Latinos? That's why every time you fill out a federal form, it says, are you Latino or Hispanic, and then your race, because we are mandated to collect that. So going back to your question, it's a constructed term. It's a made-up term. And at the time, in the mid-70s, when it was constructed, it was based on language. Another interesting thing is that when this came up, Brazilians in the census, they used to identify themselves as Latinos. Not anymore, because the conceptualization coming from there is based on language. But you're absolutely right. It's a constructed term, so it doesn't mean anything. Actually, if you look at national data, the people that self-identify as Latinx, and you say, how you self-identify yourself? Less than half of the population use Hispanic or Latino. The other half, the other quarter, use country of origin first. And guess what the other 25% use? American. So it doesn't mean anything. Actually, Latinx is that person that identifies as such in my book because of my grandmother was from here, I don't speak Spanish, you know, I'm white, I am born in the United States, and I'm Latina, and good for you. Who am I to impose on you how you self-identify? Who am I?
I think, yes, I just want to check mark that words are words. They're made up, we make them up, we use them to identify ourselves, and you can use whatever word feels comfortable for you. And I think that, you know, we don't have to put so much weight on them. I think in particular, one of the things that I want to say about identifying is that I don't typically identify myself as a Latina. I say, you know, I'm a black woman, and I say that I'm from the Dominican Republic, right? Like, I'm like, oh, I'm an immigrant, and I'm black. And so I think that for black people who come from Latin America or the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, it's a culture shift to not just call themselves Afro-Latinos, which is kind of like the watered down version of like I have African ancestry, right? It's really a culture shift to say I'm black here in this country, because it's so often not what's expected from us. And so when it comes to, you know, self-identifying, for me, I'm always just like, not an Afro-Latina, I'm a black woman, and you know, I'm an immigrant to this country, or my family is from the Dominican Republic, and I like to share those things because I know that it's not expected of me to do that. And so it's a part of like my little micro-resistance, right, is that I speak boldly about being black.
I have a question, but to ask you my question, I have to give you a little bit of context. I live in a city that it's pretty much minority, but the leadership is not representing the minority. And the other thing is that most of the organizations, non-profit and for-profit, there's only 1% of people of color that are leaders in there. And we only have one person out of 9 of the city councilors that are representing people of color. And the question that I have is the following. How do you create a space to empower Latinx in a place that the resources are not targeted for them?
So I feel like that's the business we're in right now. When I think about sort of the work that that Heights Square Task Force does, is really sort of thinking about our young people navigating, despite the fact that 40 plus, it's a little bit over 40% of the student population in Boston Public Schools is Latinx. Despite that, the systems are not working. And if you look at the leadership in City Hall, and if you look at right now we're excited because we might have the first Latinx and hopefully the first Latinx lesbian city council woman. Like that is, and we're so excited about it. And I'm like, we should be excited about it, but it's about time, And so it's this thing of like, when I think about it, even in Boston where we are a majority city, and I just feel like we're constantly sort of fighting the battle, and really it's part of it is on the individual level, equipping our young people to make sure that they're ready to navigate sort of that world, but at the same time is also pushing for change on a more systematic level, right? And making sure that there's advocacy and pushing for policies to change so that the structure can change. So it's working on both levels, both the individual, because if we just wait for the structure to change, we might be waiting for another 100 years, I don't know. But it's sort of really working on both the individual and I think the systemic level, just to be able to continue to push for things to shift.
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that came up to me, particularly talking about city council, is that, 5 years ago, how many black women did we have on city council in the city, right? And now this is how many we have. And so I think that my response to that is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are other communities who also haven't had resources allotted for them, who have shown us how to carve out space. And so I don't think that we need to reinvent the wheel. I think that as people, black and brown people, it's like, oh, I saw that you did this. How did you do that? Teach us how to do that. Let's learn from that. How do we exchange? Because ultimately that's where our power is. And so I would say that there's so much there for us to look to on how we carve out our own space. And I think that these 4 folks who are running for city council right now, they're following the template. They're like, oh, this is the map and we're gonna do it. And that's exactly what's happening. And so I think it's just about, I think to the question that you asked earlier here, right? What was happening, what happened before, how does that inform what we're doing now?
Hi, I'm Patricia, this is my daughter Lexi. And I don't really have a question, but I wanted to share, that my mom, a Panamanian, migrated to this country.
Wait, ¿tú eres de Panamá?
Panama.
Oh, yeah, me too? Oh, sorry.
And okay. My daughter's saying, keep it short, the millennial. And I studied sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, some 30 plus years ago, under Dr. Harry Edwards, sports medicine guru and all of that. But what I wanted to share, not so much a question, I grew up in Southern California from an immigrant, my mom from Panama, and at the time, she would use reference as African American. Then in the 60s, it wasn't African American, it was black. It wasn't even Black American, it was Negro. And then she would use the word colored. And we would say, Mom, you can't say colored. Colored is, taboo, that's bad. And so fast forward years later in the 80s and the 90s, we became African American. And then when you fill out those surveys, you had a choice: Latino, African, non-Hispanic, African American, or Black American. So the names have changed. And my feeling is that we can't get so into labels that we lose the human that is consistent in every culture, every gender, every lifestyle, is the human. That's the bottom common denominator. And as I talk to I'm 56, okay? I know I look good. My daughter, she's 26. Okay. All right, okay. She's on Instagram, okay? She studied Mandarin for 5 years, okay? So, been to China twice. The girl, our kids, my husband's Panamanian American. He's phenomenal in Dallas, okay? And, okay, the point is, I just don't want us to, as a people, to lose the human factor. We could, imagine today we're saying, and my daughter always corrects me, LGBTQIA, okay? And 10 years from now, it's gonna be something else, CDXY. So if we do not keep human in those labels, we will forget the commonality, what we all have in common. So whether you're in Cuba, you're in Panama, you're in Costa Rica, blah, 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 we are all human. And so we cannot, my contribution to the discussion, again, having a mom who was born in 1935, who when she came to America, she was told that we do not let Negroes play in the casinos in Las Vegas. She never heard that word. It was not part of the custom in Panama. Do you get what I'm saying? So I think that as we educate and share and progress, we cannot leave human out of the labels that we attach to our experiences.
Thank you so much. I love meeting other Panamanians. We're so rare. You never find us. For real? Wait, ¿qué parte de Panamá? What kind? What part? Dale. Okay. Do you guys wanna respond to that comment, or shall we keep going? Questions?
You have
Dale.
a couple more questions over there.
First, I want to say thank you. Your talk is definitely empowering. It's very helpful. My question to everybody is more like, in the Latino X household, we don't express weakness like whatsoever. We never like have that moment of rest and express ourselves. We always say "echa para adelante," "en la lucha," things like that. So we self-condition, like even like my parents' generations to myself, to even to my younger cousins. We tell them like, you know, keep moving forward no matter what. So like in your life or just in your career, how do you deal with like weakness when like just life has you like you just don't care, like when you're like almost when you hit rock bottom? How do you just deal with like with weakness in the workplace and things like that?
You know, I think about, I think a lot of what you've said, Kendra, which is being sort of reflective and being able to what extent do you start being transparent and honest in naming things? So this has been one of the hardest things for me to learn actually over the past 3 years. You know, I had, up until 3 years ago, I had positions where I was senior positions in different institutions, but I was part of a small team. I was not the leader in front. And so I could very much just kind of play my part. And, you know, those moments that I was feeling very weak, it was okay. I didn't have to, pretty much, I could just play it off and not be honest about it. Now, as a leader of an organization, I have been tested in many ways because I am doing a job that I think it's hard. Leading a nonprofit organization, not knowing if we're going to raise enough money to pay folks. I came from the side where I was giving away money, right? And giving away money is a heck of a lot easier than asking for it. And so being in that position, and then I've also had some personal challenges happening. And, you know, I had to make decisions of like, do I show up to staff meeting and play the strong, sort of, I have it together, con ganas, hay que seguir, you know, we can do this. Or do I look at my staff and be honest and say, guys, you know what? This last quarter, we didn't do as well as we should have done fundraising. So this is where we find ourselves. You know, I don't want to worry you. I'm not putting my worries on you, but I want to be honest with you. Because if I'm walking up and down the hall and maybe I don't look as animated right now, it's because this is what I'm carrying with me. And I feel like as a leader, it's what I need to do. I need to be honest. And I just need to put it out there and I need to name it. And I recognize that by saying, you know, by actually naming things, it's my staff that feel like they can share things with me and say, you know, this is what I'm bringing with me right now. And that has really shifted because it's really challenged sort of the dominant way of being a leader that I've heard up to like this point, right? You're toughen up, you just do what you need to do. And that's a good leader. And I'm like, no, I'm human and I'm gonna show my humanity.
I have the privilege to shape the next generation of Latinx social workers of this country. And I chose my words carefully, privilege. As a leader, I'm very aware of this privilege. So the day that I go to work and I said, I cannot take this anymore, I go to the communities. Because this is not about me. This is about the communities. The LLI has 130 graduates and 60 current students, over 10% of the total population on the School of Social Work. 5 years ago, it was 3%. So that's where I go. I go to East Boston. I go to Dorchester. I go and I see what they are doing. And I see the impact they are having in the communities because they come from the community. And I have that privilege and that opportunity and that power. And I have always that in mind. This is not about me. This is not even about my students. This is about the communities. This is about the recent arrivals. This is about the unaccompanied minors. This is about the unauthorized communities that just got here that are terrified to ask for anything if they are entitled because of the current climate. That toxic stress. And I have the privilege to train the people that are going to work with them to be effective. That's what keeps me going.
I am recovering from this kind of like mentality of how do I have to be. I think particularly when you're a person of color, you know, there's a saying that says you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And so there's always that expectation of like perform, right? Capitalism. How much of your work is like creating something, some kind of benefit, monetarily or otherwise for the organization. And I find myself that I was always typically the youngest person in the position that I was in. And so I could never be perceived as I didn't know what I was doing because I was already pushing the envelope being there, right? So if you're gonna be here, you have to be exceptional. And being exceptional means that you have to have the answers, you have to know what we're doing. And so I developed the always know what I'm talking about complex, where you can ask me anything and I will know something about that. I'll be like, oh, and if I don't know, I'll be like, I know 3 people. Because it creates like that need in you to always know. And, you know, I'm brilliant and I appreciate that and that's great. But also, I think structurally, as leaders within organizations, you can create the space to build that. It's not always, you can always model it, but if you're not creating the space for doing those things, for people to be vulnerable and transparent, then it doesn't always happen. And so some of the practices that we have in my organization are mutual support practices. And we implement practices where we are doing deep check-ins every week. We have our staff meeting starts with a 1-hour lunch. And it's just about how you're doing. The rule, no talk about work. And then we have our staff meeting. We have a monthly staff retreat with all of us together. And there's also a 1-hour how you're doing check-in. We even do a tarot poll if we got some time, right? And so it's really about how do you create a culture of mutual support within your organization where you're creating the space for people to bring them full selves at work. You can always model that transparency, but if there's not actually any space for anybody to say, hey, I'm struggling or this is happening, then you're not actually going to create that culture. And so I always go back to structure because our intentions will fail us, right? Like our politics will fail us. The structure is always going to be there to continue to reinforce the thing if you set it up to do that.
Thank you all. My question is about how you work to create accessibility in your organizations, and it's a bit related to the last question, and I really enjoyed the response we just heard about colleagues, but I mean accessibility both in terms of people with disabilities, but also people who are dealing with life stressors, of which there are so many in our community. When you're thinking about leadership and you see someone who has potential but does not have capacity right now, how do you handle that?
Thank you for asking that question. Accessibility is something that is very near and dear to my heart and that we talk a lot about in our organization. I think externally, we have a grant that's specifically for accessibility. And so any of the organizations that get funded by Resist, if they want to make their work more accessible in any way, that can mean from translating things to we need to build a ramp outside of our building. And they can apply for a grant to do their regular work and then also an accessibility grant to make their work more accessible. And so I think organizationally, there is a commitment to that from us. We also, like if folks need their applications to, everything is electronic nowadays. We know that some people in rural communities don't have access to the internet. And so we mail people applications, let them mail them in. We translate applications for people. And so there's a number of ways, we have a commitment to doing that. And there are some ways that we do it and we could be 100 times better, and we're trying to make that commitment. I think the reason I just wrote about this actually for our organization, for me, is that I have a belief that our movement should be for everybody. And here's my practice in vulnerability. I have a 3-year-old son who's on the spectrum, who has autism. And, you were always coming up in the movement, you have these dreams of your children are also going to organize. And then I started to think about what the limitations would be for that. Is our movement really built to hold people who are neurodivergent and who function differently than we are? And so I have dreams of how can we become more accessible, not only as an organization, but as a movement. How do we make space for all of those people?
Is quickly financial aid, and then analyzing our implicit curriculum. What procedures we have in our organization that prevent the accessibility of everyone. What is going on in everything we do since you go there and somebody tells you hello till you graduate, that either helps you or doesn't for you to graduate. We have done that exercise last year, an exhaustive implicit curriculum self-assessment with indicators, and then we have distributed to everyone, we have presented about it, and we have task forces because we have truly identified what are our weak points in the system, also what are our strengths in the procedures we use so we can modify them in the system, in the structure.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very nourishing, vulnerable conversation.